what's going on, considering in Europe with Davos, and they're talking about the conflict in Ukraine, and the NATO Secretary General is evaluating Russia, is somehow trying to understand what is happening in Russia, that they're capable of continuing this conflict. And here is, let me play a clip of Mark Rutte talking about that. And I wanted to know, what is your understanding of the mindset on the part of Europeans, basically?
Russia is on a war economy footing. They spend 40% of the state budget on defense, 200 billion a year, with a spending power with the 200 billion because of the structure of their economy, which is much higher than we can do in Europe. So we really have to be watchful here. Yes, we can defend ourselves today, but we have to deliver on the Hague commitments. Not because of Donald Trump. Yes, it equalizes with the US, that keeps them in, but particularly because we have to defend ourselves. Alex, I love you, but you are not producing enough. Your defense industrial base has to ramp up, and you know it, so please spend time on that. And this is true for the whole of NATO territory.
This total is somehow, it's a show, in my opinion. They don't know somehow what they're talking about, and they're trying to make sense of their ideology. And what is your understanding of the mindset of Europeans today?
What a difficult question that is, Nima. So many will look back in history and debate this fundamental question. What is going on in the minds of Europeans? I think, first of all, let's just separate the European public from the European political elites in that sense. I'm not saying that a lot of Europeans are, especially the sort of middle class, the managerial class, the bourgeois class, the academics, they are brainwashed. They are heavily propagandized throughout Europe, and I think that's been the case for quite a while. However, I think there is a general recognition on this street level of Europe that there is absolutely zero desire to go to war or prepare to go to war against Russia. I think most working class people understand that. That's reflected in a lot of polling. You see the split between East and West Germany on that issue. And I could say the same about other countries as well. So, but what's going on in Davos? You know, what's amazing about the World Economic Forum is that they spent the last 20 years making it all about green this, green that, climate this, climate that, and then they've completely shifted and pivoted to war, a wartime economy, basically. So it's AI, it's weapons, it's war, it's Russia. So it really goes to show you that there are no principles at all at this level. There's no consistent ideology other than profit-making, rent-seeking economic activity at the expense of their public, basically. And, you know, Mark Rutte, as the Secretary General of NATO, is a perfect example of some kind of bureaucrat that's put in this position at NATO, much like the previous one, which was basically a banker, Jan Stoltenberg. And you have bankers at the heads of major European states now. Emmanuel Macron is a banker. Friedrich Merz, a banker. So the bankers are in charge pretty much across the board with the major European states. And what sort of ideas or solutions do they have for their population? Nothing. They're selling this idea of good defense jobs. So they're predicating economic growth on defense spending. This is military Keynesianism, is the only sort of, before it was sustainable green economy, you know, that's basically most of the Davos and then Davos pivoted to Ukraine, and then it became a virtue signaling platform for Zelensky and the Ukraine cause and so forth. And now it's full on, let's prepare for war with Russia. So but this is coming at an interesting time. Davos always exists as a kind of an island. It's a kind of an intellectual elite confab where they go, and they've been meeting there since the 70s. And ever since they started meeting at the World Economic Forum, things have gotten progressively worse. And they haven't come up with any solutions. They didn't foresee the subprime mortgage crisis, the economic crash, and these are supposedly the best minds in the world. So it goes to show you that they're really not there for the reasons they claim they're there, which is for the sort of greater good of the people. They're there to serve the people who pay for the World Economic Forum, which are the major transnational corporations, the sort of AI cartel that's now forming, the big tech cartel. These are in the ascendancy. So it's like a think tank. Davos, it's like the think tank for the Bilderberg Group. Bilderberg Group meets in June, and that's for big industries to make decisions to consolidate industry and then translate that into political leverage in order to sustain that cartel. So it's kind of a self-producing, replicating sort of system that they have. So this is the think tank. So what's interesting, Nima, is the timing of this, that some people were dropping some truth bombs at Davos. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, who himself is an arch central banker himself, has no political experience at all, pretty much sailed into this role after Justin Trudeau vacated the scene there in Canada. And so Carney's dropped this bomb basically saying that the rules-based international order is now null and void, and that the major powers are taking advantage of this and only applying international law when it suits them. You know, that's what we've been saying, and you've been saying, and your guests have been saying for years on these podcasts. So he's dropping this truth bomb, and he said something that's really important. He said the middle-tier countries, the middle-tier powers. So he's now identifying, and this is the fundamental shift, Nima, because before all of these lower and middle-tier countries, I'm talking about European individual states, have always rid on the back end the coattails of the United States. So all the clout, when you see the European leaders get together and you see Mette Frederiksen from Denmark and Kalia Kallas from Estonia, these are sort of second, in some cases, lower tier countries, you know, population of 3 million in Estonia, I think. And, you know, and they're sitting there taking this big EU platform or this big NATO platform to try to browbeat countries like Russia and China. Well, they have no clout at all. Their clout is completely derived from NATO. And NATO is a U.S.-led institution, military alliance, U.S.-driven, the power, the heavy lifting, everything's done, the clout, it comes from the U.S. So everyone else is second tier. Britain is near second tier because they're more or less second partner in NATO to the U.S. in terms of the command structure traditionally. But all these other are sort of second, third tier powers. And so Carney has elucidated this. Macron is also making similar noises right now because they're realizing with the U.S., with the Trump administration, that this idea that there's enough trust between NATO partners, that there's enough agreement, that there's acknowledgement of other countries' sovereignty. That's the mortar that holds that arrangement together. And I would say the same with the European Union. And those cracks have not fully appeared yet, but they already have in Central Europe with Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. So EUs will be a slower fracturing. But NATO, you can see the gaping wounds right now. And so now that whole thing is coming apart. That includes everything that goes with that, including the 5% GDP spending. And already Donald Trump's retaliating, saying that, well, the U.S. is going to withdraw some of its support for NATO. We're talking about, you know, drills, advisory boards, funding for other activities that make the NATO organization work. The U.S. is threatening to back off of some of this stuff. So now you can see that the alliance is, so their hawkish stance against Russia is completely done under the wing of the United States, so that the Mark Ruttes of the world can grandstand around on these platforms at Munich or at WEF, or, you know, sail around to Washington and sort of puff his chest out. He's doing that with the U.S. behind him as the bully with the big stick. If the U.S. isn't behind Europe and behind the European partners, then they're just a collection of small, weak countries that can't agree on anything traditionally. I mean, let's be honest. Look at European history. World wars have been fought, devastating, just massacres of civilian populations over sort of petty royalist, monarchist, or ethno-tribal disagreements or land grabs about small territories and so forth. World wars have been fought over this. And so the Europeans have shown that they haven't really lost this sort of genetic defect that they have of old Europe, and they've carried that into new Europe, but it's only been allowed to carry through under the sort of aegis of the U.S. dominated umbrella and nuclear deterrent, you see. And so now you can see the fissures. So now the true characters are going to show. And if you have sane leadership in Europe, they'll be forced to be realists and be sane. Now, if the United States is no longer the sort of dominating shadow over all European foreign policy affairs. And this means that people like Ursula von der Leyen are going to be hit hard because they have to answer for all of their sort of past positions that have gotten the Union to this position. And that means these leaders who have been pushing for this war either going to have to pivot quickly and throw their predecessors under the bus, like Olaf Scholz and some of these people that are absolutely culpable in getting Europe to this position where it's looking at zero economic growth. And last thing I'll say, Nima, and this is important, do the math. If the U.S. is demanding that European countries spend 5% of GDP on NATO defense, okay, then if they would normally have 3 to 5% economic growth before the Ukraine war or normal times, 0% economic growth on aggregate, it's much higher than 5% GDP. Relative GDP spending compared to previous economic performance, now you're talking about 7, 8% in real relative terms. It's basic math. And what country can afford these countries that are already imposing austerity measures, that are already carrying high debt to GDP ratios, like France, for instance, as an example? How can they afford to spend in real terms, real relative terms, 7 to 8% of their GDP on, quote, defense against a threat that only became a threat because the United States did a coup in Ukraine in 2014 that caused the spark that turned into a brush fire, and then the U.S. is demanding that they spend and buy weapons from them. It's a protection racket. NATO, run by the U.S., now people can see it. I'm just waiting for European leaders to be honest about what this arrangement has been for years.
When does that, when are we going to see that moment of honesty, in your opinion? Is the case of Greenland hitting Europe to go in that direction?
Absolutely. So a couple of clues have appeared in the last couple of weeks, which I think are significant. One of them is that the prime ministers and presidents of Italy, Germany, and France, the governments are now have approached Brussels and are asking them to appoint a special envoy to Moscow. So they want to reopen diplomatic relations, or at least official dialogue channels with Russia. Now that's interesting. Okay, so Maloney, Macron, Merz. Okay, so if that's the case, that's a sea change from where we've been in the last 3 to 4 years. 4 years now, coming up in February with the Ukraine conflict. So that's a major clue. The other clue is that this is coming at the same time that the U.S. has had this visible split with Europe over the direction of Ukraine negotiations. So what Donald Trump is attempting to do is to create leverage. So he's pushing the Greenland issue very aggressively, and then he would then plan to back off to a sort of moderate fallback position on that in exchange for trying to get Europe to do what he wants on Ukraine. Of course, this could benefit Russia. And so we're seeing the clues of this now, the softening of the hawkish rhetoric. So from this point of view, whether it's intentional or not, with Trump, it's hard to read whether this is, secret 400D chess or whether this is just a natural effect of what Trump is doing in terms of trying to reestablish U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, or the Donroe Doctrine, as it were, with regards to Greenland. Okay, so but the problem is, Nima, he's doing the same with the board of peace. So he needs to make the board of peace in Gaza work. So Trump, this administration in the U.S., these are not individual situations. They're all linked through leverage. So already Germany has expressed doubts about the board of peace. They're saying that it has huge implications for international law. He's now snubbed Macron in terms of an invitation. I don't think the French were keen on joining for similar reasons that Germany is having questions about. But Russia also has withheld its answer in terms of being invited, as has China. China has been invited, but Chinese are reviewing the situation and have not answered. So forget China. Trump is not going to be able to exert any leverage over China. He believes that he can get some movement with Russia on this by using the Ukraine situation to push Russia to endorse his what's really a sort of non-state entity, a corporate board that Trump will sit as chairman on for life. This is what the recent reports have shown. So they're all linked, and it's bad timing, because if you push a little bit too much and a few tweets and a few very insulting comments via Greenland, threatening comments, well, Europeans can withdraw their support for the Gaza project, and it has no legitimacy at that point. It's just going to be a board of peace on paper. So he could lose. Now, the U.S. deep state can also lose if Europe starts to gradually change its orientation towards Russia and maybe coming more to meet in the middle. Now, over time, but the U.S. can then switch that. This is the problem with Trump, is he can turn the dial up, turn it down, and turn it back up again, and maybe pander to some of the more hawkish parties in Europe, like the UK, for instance, is always ready to, talk up a war against Russia. They're always sitting on the sideline because after Brexit, especially, they feel they can play that role from safely without being in Europe, but pushing Europe towards with the U.S. towards a militarized confrontation with Russia. So, but the thing is, Nima, this can break. This can break in a couple of. What's holding this whole illusion together of East versus West? It's very weak now. It's very weak, and people are now seeing through the facade that they've had to live with for decades regarding what in the U.S. This is the other thing. The U.S. have this talking point, and it's very popular among conservatives and the J.D. Vances of the world and people that are, quite frankly, or were geopolitically illiterate before they came into office. Okay, they knew nothing about anything, and they're saying that Europe's been ripping us off. Europe's been ripping us off. You've heard the talking point. It's the other way around. The post-World War II arrangement between Europe and the U.S. has always been to the benefit of the United States. And it did offer some stability and allowed certain markets to develop, Germany being a good example of that. But the downside of this for Germany was that Germany's economy and Germany's politics in terms of foreign policy, it was never, it's not really, it's bifurcated. It's bifurcated, basically. That's different. And Germans never had a big colonial empire historically, not like the British and the French. So you look at the diplomatic skills and foreign policy skills of the British and the French. It's much more advanced and much more developed than Germany. And Germany took a huge blow after World War II and basically had its entire state institutions stripped down and rebuilt up. But Germany just focused on its economics, okay? But now you can see it was the fact that the euro-dollar market, which now is bigger than the petrodollar market in real terms in the Middle East, in terms of what is bought and sold and held in dollar reserves in the euro market. So maintaining the value of the dollar as a world reserve currency, which allows the U.S. to deficit spend and have a $1.5 trillion military budget, and then enforce that compliance globally with hard power, that's all predicated on all of these dollar zones around the world, which Europe is probably the biggest and most significant. Well, what's happened as a result of Greenland? Denmark is withdrawing its pension, one of its major pension funds just pulled $100 million out divesting, de-dollarizing. Now, that's a small amount, but it's part of a trend. So if you start to see people going for the exit doors in Europe in terms of dollar investments, like pension funds and major institutions, and then start dumping U.S. debt, then you have a major trend, because if Europe starts doing that, I think the global South is safe to start doing more of that as well. And that consensus that you have in the West, the rules-based international order, what underpins that ultimately is cooperation and trust between these top-tier and G7 powers. And Trump is taking a wrecking ball to it. And by doing that, he's taking a wrecking ball to the U.S. Economic power. And if you reduce economic power, you also reduce, in the same token, you reduce political power and influence. Political influence, geopolitical influence comes from economic influence. And they've been able to exert this punishment against countries like Iran, target nations like Syria, Venezuela. They're not going to do the same type of economic warfare against Europe, although they've fired a few warning shots, tariffs against European countries, because they're not going with the Greenland land acquisition plan of Trump. So he's caused a trade war with Europe, and at a time when Europe is already making sacrifices for the U.S. and buying its LNG for exorbitant prices after most likely the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and it was a U.S.-led operation. There's probably other NATO countries that were involved in it, but big sacrifices Europe has had to make for really a U.S.-dominated and a U.S.-steered kind of geopolitical and foreign policy agenda. And so more punishments coming from the U.S., and at some point, there's a breaking point, even for the Europeans. And I think we're now seeing where those lines are.